Part 5. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 41. Zongfu. Zhou Mingli took a leisurely sip of tea, and Chen Yuxian called a maid in who was passing by the door and asked, "Is my uncle back?" The maid shook her head and said, "Not yet." Zhou Mingli put down his teacup and said, "Madam, what are you in a hurry for? Sujia village is in Jian County, not close to here. He comes and goes. Even with a carriage, it's not so fast. What do you know?" Chen Yuxian glanced at him and said, "I'm worried that Ninger won't come back." "Why?" Zhou Mingli looked at her and said in surprise, "Where else can he go if he doesn't come back? Miss Zaira grew up with his childhood sweetheart. What if he thinks of the past and doesn't plan to come back?" Chen Yuxian said with a worried expression on his face, "What should I do? Wouldn't she become a spirit? It's a joke in Zhoucheng. It's irrelevant whether Governor Dong will attack again. How will she behave in the future? Her life's happiness will be ruined." When Zhou Mingli heard this, his expression became serious. At this moment, the maid just ran in again and said, "Master, Madam, my uncle is back." Zhou Mingli stood up and said, "I'll go see him." Chen Yuxian nodded and reminded, "Don't be so straightforward with your words. Just ask Ninger what she is thinking." "I know." Zhou Mingli nodded and walked out of the room. A lot of things happened today. Tang Ning had just returned from outside and was ready to sort out her thoughts. Zhou Mingli knocked on the door and walked in from the outside. He walked to the table and sat down, looked at Tang Ning and asked, "How is the girl's health?" Tang Ning sat across from him and said, "It won't be a problem if you rest for a while." Zhou Mingli looked at him and asked, "Did you remember anything from the past when you went back?" Tang Ning shook her head. Zhou Mingli saw that there seemed to be a sad look on his brows, thought for a while, and said, "You are still young and have great years to live. You will go through many things in the future. It doesn't matter if you can't take the state examination this time. You will still have a chance next time." Of course, Tang Ning was not thinking about the state examination. What he was thinking about was that Zaira was in Sujia village. The distance was too far. If something happened, it would be difficult for him to know immediately. Should he take her to the state capital? She would definitely not adapt to living in Zhou Mansion, nor would she agree. If he wanted to buy a house outside, he didn't have that much money. He had no place to spend money on weekdays. The pocket money was given by Zhongai last time. Zhou Mingli looked at him and suddenly asked, "Miss Zairu, what are you going to do?" Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "I plan to take her to the capital first." Zhou Mingli nodded and said, "That's right. The distance is closer and it is easier to take care of. I will arrange this matter." Tang Ning actually didn't intend to ask her father-in-law for help. Just when she was about to refuse, Zhou Mingli suddenly looked at him and said, "Actually, fate is a wonderful thing sometimes. It doesn't necessarily mean that the earlier the better." Tang Ning looked at him with some confusion. The first sentence was still "Xiao are you," but the next sentence mentioned fate. Is this change of topic too abrupt? Zhou Mingli smiled and said, "Your mother-in-law and I have been together for nearly 20 years, and we have never had a big quarrel. Do you know why? Let's not talk about why the topic he talked about today is so confusing, but why the couple never had a big quarrel." After more than 2 months of getting along, Tang Ning certainly knew. Because once the quarrel becomes larger and more intense, the reason for the quarrel is not important. What is important is that he dared to quarrel with his mother-in-law. Then he should be slapping his back and squeezing his shoulders. How could there be any quarrel? But he couldn't say this. Tang Ning looked at Zhou Mingli and pretended to be unsure, because of fate. Zhou Mingli shook his head and said, "It's not necessarily fate. In fact, I met a woman before her." He looked at Tang Ning and said, "We grew up together, childhood sweethearts, and have already reached the stage of discussing marriage. Tang Ning grabbed a handful of melon seeds from the plate on the table and asked, "What happened next?" "Later, due to some reasons, we separated." Zhou Mingli looked at him and said, "Later, I passed the Jinqi examination and then met your mother-in-law. In the past 10 years, we have experienced many ups and downs, and we have been in the same boat. Along the way, it has been so harmonious and beautiful." Tang Ning thought this was an old drama about childhood sweethearts who couldn't compete with each other. After hearing this, she was a little disappointed, but she didn't know what her father-in-law was telling her about his love history on a whim today. Zhou Mingli looked at him and said meaningfully, "I am saying this to tell you that fate has nothing to do with order." Tang Ning put down the melon seeds in her hand and coughed lightly. "I was just like you." Zhou Mingli looked at him and said, "Fate does not follow order, and it makes no sense. Some people are destined but not, and some people are not. You will understand these things in the future." Tang Ning glanced outside the door and coughed again. "Is your throat uncomfortable?" Zhou Mingli looked at him, took a cup from the table and said, "Drink some water to moisten your throat." "Oh, how come I have never heard that Mr. Zhou has a childhood sweetheart who almost talked about getting married but was not destined to be married?" A voice without any emotion came from outside the door. Zhou Mingli's body trembled and the teapot in his hand almost fell to the ground. Tang Ning walked out of his room, and the door of his room was closed from the inside. He was not stupid, he knew what his father-in-law meant by what he said just now. He was worried that he would abandon Zhongyi because of Xiao Ryu, and then Zhongyi's life would be ruined. Although he and Zhongyi were not husband and wife, he could not let her fall into such a situation just because she cooked for him every night and the Zhong family showed him kindness. But he could not ignore Xiao Ryu. Although he was not the Xiao Ning brother she knew, who would believe this statement? Tang Ning himself could hardly convince himself with such a reason. A woman who could walk dozens of miles every day, running back and forth between the state capital and the village, searching hard, if he did something to hurt her, how different would he be from an animal? There is another important point. If he ignored Xiao Ryu, wouldn't he become Tang Shimei? If someone with good intentions turns their own imaginary stories into jokes, wouldn't he become a heartless man who abandoned his childhood sweetheart to get close to the county magistrate? There may be no more cases of beheading the beauty in the future, and instead, there will be cases of beheading Ning. He looked at his household registration today. He is only 17 years old this year, and he will be 18 in a few months. In other words, he is still a child. Why should a 17-year-old child face such a thing? When he walked out of the gate, he saw Tang Yaoyao standing not far in front of him, looking down at her toes, pacing in place. Tang Ning sighed. She felt guilty enough for losing her memory after being hit by a hydrangea. In this matter, Su Ryu and Zhongyi fell into an awkward situation. And the instigator of all this Tang Yaoyao must think it was herself. Tang Ning needs to enlighten her, otherwise, he is really worried that Tang Yaojin will not be able to get over it and will be unable to think clearly. Tang Ning walked over and asked, "What are you doing here?" Tang Yaoyao looked up at him and Tang Ning found that her eyes were a little red and swollen. She looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Are you really unable to take the state exam?" Tang Ning shook his head and said, "It's really not your fault. I can't pass the exam anyway. I just realized today that I didn't study hard before." Tang Yaoyao knew that he was comforting her, and she felt even more guilty. Her voice was also filled with tears. "It's all my fault. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have missed the state exam, and Xiaoi and that girl wouldn't have." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "Didn't we agree that you would teach me martial arts and our previous grievances would be written off?" Tang Yaoyao wiped her eyes. "That's different." "Why is it different?" Tang Ning shook his head and said, "At most, when you teach me martial arts, you should be more serious and responsible, and teach me your best skills." He suddenly thought of something, looked Tang Yaoyao up and down, looked at her eagerly, and said, "If you really feel that you owe me too much and want to repay me, then." Tang Yao Yao was chilled by his gaze, her face was shocked, she covered her chest with her hands, and said vigilantly, "What do you want to do?" Tang Ning looked at her and said expectantly, "Or, lend me some money." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 42. In the past, Tang Ning didn't need to spend money. At most, she would buy a few buns and give them to the beggars when she went out. When you ask someone to do something, you have to get some reward. How much are a few buns worth? He has not spent all the pocket money Zhongyi gave him 2 months ago. But it's different now. For Zhongyi, he cannot leave Zhong Mansion for the time being. But he couldn't ignore Xiru. She lived in Sujiakan and it took a long time to come back and forth. Tang Ning couldn't take care of her all the time. The best way is to buy a house for her in the city, as close to the Zhong Mansion as possible. This method had the best of both worlds. The only problem was that Tang Ning had no money. Let alone a house, he couldn't even afford the front door of the house. He can't afford it, but someone can. As the richest man in Lingzhou, the Tang family has enough money leaking from the fingers of the eldest daughter of the Tang family to buy a house. Tang Yao Yao looked at him and asked, "Are you short of money?" "Short of money?" Tang Ning nodded. There was nothing to be embarrassed about. Compared with Fairy Tang, everyone was short of money. From the bottom of his heart, he would rather borrow the money to buy the house from Tang Yao Yao than trouble his father-in-law. Tang Yao Yao sniffed and asked, "How much do you want? Is 10,000 taels enough? If it's not enough, I'll ask my father for it." It's not without reason that Tang Ning likes Tang Yao Yao. It's not just because of her long legs. Who wouldn't like a woman who is cheerful, straightforward, spends a lot of money, and has long legs? Tang Ning really didn't know much about the housing prices in Yong'an County, but she definitely wouldn't need 10,000 taels, nor would she buy a big house. 1,000 taels would be enough to buy everything. Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "Let's borrow 1,000 taels first." Tang Yao Yao took out a stack of silver notes from her sleeve, handed it to him casually, and said, "I don't know how many these are, but they must be 1,000 taels. You can use them first. If you don't have enough, come to me. There is no need to return them." Although Tang Yao Yao did not lack the Chien or 800 taels of silver, Tang Ning always had principles in doing things. Borrowing means borrowing, and of course the money borrowed must be repaid. "This is 1,800 taels." He counted the banknotes in his hand, counted 8 of them and handed them to her, saying, "I will borrow 1,000 taels first. Within 1 year, I will borrow the principal with interest, give it back to you." Tang Yao Yao shook her head and said, "I said you don't need to pay it back." Tang Ning ignored her. His room was occupied. He went to Zhonggai's study to write an IOU, put his thumbprint on it, walked out and handed it to her, saying, "Put away the IOU." Tang Yao Yao was about to speak when she saw the serious expression on his face. After being stunned for a moment, she reached out to take the IOU and put it away. Tang Ning then looked at her and said, "You were crying just now because I couldn't take the state exam." Tang Yao Yao wiped her eyes quickly and asked, "Who is crying?" Tang Ning pointed at her and said, "You still have tears on your face." Tang Yao Yao wiped his face randomly and said angrily, "I didn't." Tang Ning looked at her and said helplessly, "I didn't wipe it off." "I told you, I didn't." Tang Yao Yao stamped her foot violently, causing a green brick on the ground to break into several pieces. "Well, I have something to do with Peng Chen." Tang Ning turned around and walked outside. Tang Ning was not familiar with the process of buying a house. He had never been exposed to land deeds and the like. His father-in-law asked Peng Chen to stay with him. In addition to being a bodyguard, he also worked part-time as an assistant. Peng Chen talks little and is a good follower except for the suspicion of having special quirks. He talks little and won't annoy him. He does things cleanly and neatly. When you don't need him, he will never appear in front of you. When you need him, you can see him when you turn around. Such an assistant is hard to find. Wait until he makes money in the future. If you have money, you must give him a salary increase. When I finished asking Peng Chen, the sky had darkened. Tang Ning returned to the room, sat at the table and thought about something. After some time, she felt a little hungry. He now habitually feels hungry at night. Just as he was about to go to the kitchen to clean up, there was a knock on the door. Ching stood outside the door holding a tray with 2 side dishes and a bowl of white porridge. Zhongyi said that it is best to eat something light at night, and 2 dishes and 1 porridge have become his standard late-night snack. Ching placed the tray on his table. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Did you make this?" Ching shook her head and said, "This is what the lady did." "Then, where is she?" Ching said, "The lady said she was a little tired and would go back to the room first." Tang Ning sat down at the table, and Ching suddenly asked, "Uncle, I have a question." "Just ask." Tang Ning took a bite of the porridge, and it still tasted familiar. "I think my uncle is very good." Ching looked at him and said doubtfully, "But they all say that my uncle is not good at it." "What is wrong with my uncle?" Tang Ning almost spat out her second mouthful of porridge and said through gritted teeth, "Them? Who are they?" "That's everyone." Ching looked at him doubtfully and asked, "Uncle, what's wrong with you?" As the culprit of this matter, she actually asked herself this question. It was midnight, a man and a woman alone. If she hadn't been worried about the news that Mr. Zhong's uncle was a beast and not a human being, and had raped the maid in the middle of the night, her butt would have been swollen. Tang Ning took a bite of vegetables and drank a mouthful of porridge, then looked at her and said with a smile, "I have nothing to do now, so let me tell you a story." "Yeah." Ching no longer struggled with the question of whether he could do it or not, and hurriedly sat down opposite him, with a look of anticipation on her face. Tang Ning put down her chopsticks and lowered her voice and said, "Once upon a time, in a wealthy family, there was a little maid named Zhener." Ching held her face in her hands and listened attentively. "According to the story my uncle told me before, will this little maid named Zhener be attracted by a great talent and end up with the prince or prince?" Tang Ning's voice was erratic. Zhener was very beautiful. This young lady from a wealthy family was very jealous of her, so one night, he cut her face with a hairpin and pushed her into a dry well and fell to death. Ching sat up straight, her face turned a little pale, and she no longer held her face with her hands. After Zhener died, her resentment turned into a fierce ghost. She died because she was beautiful, so she hated those beautiful women very much. Every night, at midnight, she would crawl out of the mirror and climb on those beautiful women' bed, and scratched their faces with hairpins. Tang Ning finished her supper and finished telling the story of Midnight Virgin. She looked at Ching and said, "Okay, it's very late and the story is over. Let's go back quickly." Ching stood up, opened the door, looked into the dark night, looked back at Tang Ning, and said in a trembling voice, "Uncle, I don't dare." Tang Ning smiled and said, "It's okay, I'll take you back. Love the room." She made the bed, looked back at Tang Yao Yao, and asked, "Why do you suddenly want to sleep with me today?" The two have been good sisters since childhood and often sleep together at night, but as they grow up, they sleep in the same bed less often. Tang Yao Yao put his hands behind his head, lay on the bed, and said, "I can't sleep. I want to talk to you." She turned sideways, looked at Zhongyi, and said, "Because of me, he can't take the state exam. I ruined his future. This matter is over." Zhongyi held her hand and said, "He didn't blame you, and he often asked me to tell you not to blame yourself for this matter." "Then do you blame me?" Tang Yao Yao looked at her and asked, "If it weren't for my recklessness, I wouldn't have hit him, and there wouldn't be Miss Su today, and neither would you. How could I blame you? Zhongyi looked at her and shook his head. If it weren't for you, there would be no Zhongyi now. Tang Yaoyao's mood improved a little, and he looked at her again and suddenly asked, Xiaoi, do you regret it? Zhongyi looked at her and asked, what do you regret? If you hadn't hid when my aunt mentioned that you two were going to church that day, would things be different now? Zhongyi was silent for a long time, then chuckled and said, it's all over. When both of them fell into silence, there was a sudden knock on the door. Zhongyi got out of bed and opened the door, and saw Qing'er standing outside the door holding a quilt. She looked at Zhongyi and asked pitifully, Miss, can I sleep with you tonight? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 43. Zhongyi looked at Qing'er's pale face and asked hurriedly, what's wrong? Qing'er sniffed and said, I'm afraid of sleeping alone. Come in quickly. After Zhongyi let her in, he closed the door and asked, why are you scared? My uncle just told a ghost story. Qing'er hugged her quilt and looked at Zhongyi and said, I'm scared to sleep alone in the room. Zhongyi smiled and said, then let's squeeze in and sleep together tonight. Tang Yaoyao sat up from the bed, looked at her, and said disdainfully, Xiao Qing'er, you are still as timid as before. Qing'er hugged the quilt and squeezed to the foot of the bed. She felt a little calmer and whispered, the ghost stories told by my uncle are very scary. Tang Yaoyao curled her lips and said, I haven't heard any ghost stories. Please tell me. With two people accompanying her, Qing'er was no longer afraid. She thought about it and said, once upon a time, in a wealthy family, there was a little maid named Zhen'er. She was very good at martial arts and had very long legs. It's also very beautiful. Later Zhen'er turned into a ghost. Every night at midnight, she would crawl out of the mirror and scratch the faces of beautiful women with hairpins. Tang Yaoyao glanced at the direction of the mirror in the room, curled her lips, and said, isn't this scary? The mirror is so small, how could she crawl out of it? And isn't she very skilled in martial arts? How could she? I'm going to take a drink of water. She got off the bed, walked to the table and took a drink of water. When she came back, she placed the mirror on the dressing table on the table. The ghost stories in this world are simply too outdated. Some of them are even mysterious stories. Add monsters and the like, and 2 or 3 sentences can form a ghost story. This kind of story can't create a scary atmosphere, and it doesn't feel like it at all. So after telling Qing'er an adapted version of Midnight Princess last night, Tang Ning had a whim and reviewed The Ring and The Grudge again. This caused him to stay awake for most of the night, and when he woke up in the morning, he had 2 dark circles under his eyes. While eating breakfast, I realized that he wasn't the only one with dark circles under his eyes. Zhong Mingli went out early in the morning. Chen Yuxian looked at the 3 people at the dinner table with big dark circles under their eyes, listless and haggard faces. Then he looked at Qing'er standing behind Zhongyi and couldn't help but ask, you four, what did you do last night? Tang Yaoyao glanced at Tang Ning with a cannibalistic look, then turned to look at Chen Yuxian and said, I talked to Xiao Yi very late last night and didn't get a good rest. Chen Yuxian asked, what about Qing'er? Qing'er immediately replied, last night, I slept with the young lady and sister Yao Yao. Chen Yuxian looked at Tang Ning again and asked, where is Ning'er? I didn't sleep with them. Tang Ning hurriedly explained, I didn't sleep well either. Chen Yuxian looked at Zhongyi and Tang Yaoyao and said, you have to go to bed early and get up early on weekdays. Look at how you look now. If you continue like this, wrinkles will appear soon, and there will be darkness under your eyes. Tang Ning took a bite of fried cucumber with eggs and said casually, dark circles can be eliminated with hard-boiled eggs. It will take about 7 days to see results. It can replenish skin, whiten and fight wrinkles, just use cucumber. Brush. 4 pairs of eyes looked at him. Zhong Yi, Tang Yao Yao, Ching that's all. Even his mother-in-law looked at him with such fiery eyes. Tang Ning couldn't help but feel a thump in her heart. The eyes were lethal. Tang Ning couldn't hold on for long as she was locked with eyes from 4 directions. He put down his chopsticks and stood up. I'm full, and there's something else I need to do. Stop. Tang Ning, who had never seen her mother-in-law speak like this, could not help but tremble. Chen Yuxian also realized that his voice was a bit loud just now, and a smile immediately appeared on his face. He looked at Tang Ning and said softly, if there is anything you need to do, don't be in a hurry. Ning please sit down first. She looked at Tang Ning and asked casually, Ning just said, what happened to the cucumbers and eggs? Using hard-boiled eggs to eliminate dark circles, speed up blood circulation, and help skin metabolism is almost a common sense known to everyone in later generations. As for green melon, it is also known as cucumber. This is a vegetable that is both edible and useful. When Tang Ning was in college, there was a female classmate who would go to the supermarket to buy fresh cucumbers every night. Cut into thin slices and apply on face. Although he has never seen it with his own eyes, he has seen it countless times in movies and TV series. They didn't expect that whitening, anti-wrinkle, hydrating and beautifying would be so attractive to them. Tang Ning thought about it and said, I forgot to read it in that book before. This is an excuse he has tried every time, and he can use this excuse for the rest of his life. Anyway, it is Tang Yao Yao's fault. He thought for a while and then said, it seems to be a medical book. The book says that eating more fresh and tender cucumbers can keep you in shape. Cut the fresh and tender cucumbers into thin slices and stick them on your face. It can replenish water and eliminate the symptoms of obesity. Wrinkles, making the skin firmer, that's all I remember. Tang Yao Yao looked at him and asked, why did you read all kinds of books before? Tang Ning said, walking around the world, I have many skills that are not overwhelming, and I have a wide range of interests. Maybe I will use them at some point. No one asked him any more questions, but the plate of cucumber scrambled eggs that had barely been touched just now was completely eaten in a short period of time. Chen Yuxian seemed very happy and served Tang Ning several dishes. Zhong Yi lowered her head, wondering what she was thinking. Tang Yao Yao glanced at him and made a mental note. Although many of the things he said and did were unbelievable, so far, he was right. He said to drink more hot water. He said a hot water bladder could relieve the pain. He can also let the white paper write on its own. He dared to put his hand into the oil pan. So he should also be able to make himself more beautiful. Although she is beautiful enough, who doesn't want to be more beautiful? It's just that he is a grown man, but he actually knows how to relieve the pain, how to whiten and nourish the face, eliminate wrinkles, and he can also write such lingering poems about boudoir. Miss Xiru and his childhood sweetheart have been together for so many years, and they have lived under the same roof for so many years, but it seems that nothing happened between the two of them. He and Xiao Ai have been married for 2 months, and he has always kept a distance from her, who is both talented and beautiful, without any overstep. He still can't get up in the morning. Huh. As if she had thought of something, Tang Yao Yao looked at Tang Ning with a strange expression on her face, and she couldn't help but shudder. Tang Ning didn't know why, but the way Tang Fairy looked at him made his skin crawl. He was going to Sujia village in a while, so he finished eating and left. When he walked to the yard, a maid happened to come over and said, Uncle, there is a girl outside looking for you. Girl. Tang Ning's heart trembled. Could it be another love debt this guy owed outside? At the door of Zhong Mansion, the concierge looked at the woman he had seen yesterday and said, Girl, don't stand outside. Go inside and wait. Su Ru smiled and shook her head and said, No need, I'll wait here for him to come out. The porter shook his head and stepped back. Sushan stood not far behind him, looked up at the wealthy family in front of him, and murmured, "Is the magistrate's house so big?" As soon as Tang Ning walked out of the Zhong mansion, she saw Su Ryu standing aside. "Why are you here?" Tang Ning walked over quickly, looked at the man again, frowned and said, "Uncle Third, Zyra needs to recuperate, why did you let her come here?" "I." The man stretched his neck, opened his mouth, and then retracted. "Brother Xiaoning, don't blame Third Uncle. I asked him to accompany me here." Su Ryu came over, took out a small purse from her sleeve, put it into his hand, and said, "You are in the city. It's not like in the village, you take the money and there is something you can use it for." Tang Ning looked at her for a long time, then sighed and said softly, "You came here early in the morning just to give me money. I'm here to deliver cloth to the cloth shop. They gave me another $1 increase today." Su Ryu smiled and said, "Go back quickly. I'll see you again in a few days." Tang Ning put the purse into her hand again and said, "You're here now, so don't go back." He looked at Peng Chen walking towards him and asked, "Is it done?" Peng Chen handed over a few pieces of paper and said, "All the places are here, you just choose one." Peng Chen was very fast. What was written on it was all the information about nearby houses, such as size, location, etc. Tang Ning looked at it, picked one with a suitable location, and said, "This is it." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 44. The house Tang Ning chose was not far from the Zhong mansion and the county government office. The two-in courtyard was a bit big for Su Ryu to live alone. Tang Ning actually wanted her third uncle and third aunt to move to the city and live with her. Firstly, it was to take care of each other, and secondly, because for so many years, if it weren't for their help, he and Zyra would have had a much harder life, and now it was time to repay them. "Brother Xiaoning, this can't be done." After knowing Tang Ning's thoughts, Su Ryu became a little anxious and said, I just live in the village. Where did you get so much money?" Tang Ning shook her head and said, "Don't worry about this." "Brother Xiaoning," Su Ryu stamped her feet, tears flashing in her eyes. Tang Ning knew that although she was weak-tempered, she also had her own perseverance. He looked at Tang Yao Yao, who came out of the Zhong mansion, and said, "The money to buy the house was borrowed from this Miss Tang, and I have to pay it back to her in the future of." Tang Ning looked at Tang Yao Yao and asked, "Did you bring the IOU?" Tang Yao Yao nodded and took out a note from his sleeve. Tang Ning glanced at Tang Yao Yao twice. She actually had the IOU with her? 2 days ago, she said that if it was not enough, she would ask her to borrow it again, and there was no need to pay it back. Although Su Ryu has never read a book and does not know many words, she can still understand these simple sentences. The anxious look on her face eased slightly. She looked at Tang Ning, shook her head and said, "Brother Ning, let's not waste this money. Be obedient." Tang Ning looked at her with a straight face and said, "It's convenient for me to take care of you when you move to the city. At most, we can work together to pay back the money." Su Ryu looked at Tang Ning. After hesitating for a moment, she nodded and said, "Then let's do it together." Tang Ning returned the IOU to Tang Yao Yao, and she ran away quickly. She always felt guilty in front of Su Ryu. With Peng Chen here, holding on to his father-in-law's skin, although all the procedures for buying a house were given the green light, the steps were indispensable. Peng Chen had someone arrange it, and Tang Ning took Su Ryu back to Zhong mansion first. Qing'er was putting thin slices of cucumber on her face. Not only her, but also the maids of the Zhong mansion each had a few slices of cucumber. Not to mention Su Ryu, even Tang Ning was shocked. Sushan's face was full of surprise. It turns out that this is the life of a wealthy family. They don't eat cucumbers, but they waste it like this. Chen Yuxian came out and saw Su Ryu. After being stunned, He immediately walked forward and said happily, Miss Xiao Ru is here, have you had dinner? Sushan rubbed his belly and said, not yet. Su Ru was a little embarrassed and whispered, third uncle. We are all one family, no need to see anyone outside. Chen Yuxian smiled and said, Ching go tell the kitchen to make some more food and deliver it over as soon as possible. Tang Ning breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, her mother-in-law and Zhongyi were more normal, unlike those maids who had never seen the world and resisted the temptation to fight wrinkles and whiten their skin. Chen Yuxian walked into the room, turned around and said to Ching by the way, tell them that there is no need to bring the sliced cucumbers. De Huandan is really a good thing. Su Ru's complexion is obviously much better than yesterday. Her mother-in-law was even more enthusiastic towards her than Tang Ning. She invited her to move to the Zhong mansion several times, but she politely refused. She held Su Ru's hand and said, if you encounter any difficulties here from now on, just tell your aunt and never see anyone outside. Su Ru nodded and said, Auntie, I understand. They moved as soon as they were told. Tang Ning was worried that if she didn't move today, she would come here again like this tomorrow. Peng Chen drove a carriage himself, found 2 servants from the yamen, and found another carriage. He left the city and went straight to Sujia village. They didn't have much to move, and the reason they used 2 carriages was because the other carriage was filled with gifts. Sujia village is not big, with only about 20 households in total. About half of the money she borrowed from Tang Yaoyao was spent on buying a house. It wouldn't take much to purchase furniture afterwards. Tang Ning spent about 20 taels on preparing gifts for every household in Sujia village. Most of them are rice, flour, grain, oil, cloth, etc., as well as 2 whole fans of pork. The villagers have simple hearts. Over the years, the 2 of them have received many favors from others, and these are just small gifts of thanks. Sujia village is not big. From the east end of the village to the west end, just 1 shout is enough. I'm going to Sushan's house to get rice, noodles, and meat. After the head of the village gave an energetic shout, the whole village began to boil in a short period of time. The third aunt looked distressed and muttered, why are you giving away things for no reason? Neighbors help each other, isn't it great? Sushan has seen the generosity of wealthy families today. Although 2 slices of pork and a lot of rice and noodles will soon be gone, he feels distressed. In front of you, you still have to show some appearance of seeing the world. To help each other, third aunt Zhao looked at him and asked, then tell me, why are Widow Qi and you helping each other? You can just give it to others, so why give it to her? Xiao Ning said this. Sushan said seriously, I didn't say it. Zhao finally calmed down and asked, how much did it cost to buy these things? Sushan scratched his head and said, about 20 taels. Zhao's chest began to feel uneasy again. She picked up the broom and hit Sushan, cursing, are you stupid? Xiao Ning is making trouble, so you follow her. Do you know how much 20 taels of silver is? Xiao Ru and I can't make 20 taels of silver in a year of weaving. Tang Ning finally squeezed out from a group of enthusiastic villagers, walked up to the 2 of them, and said, Uncle San, Aunt San, you and Xiao Ru should move to the city together. Sushan opened his mouth and asked in surprise, we are moving too? Tang Ning nodded nodding, he said, Xiao Ru usually lives alone in that house, I'm a little worried. Sushan hesitated, but what about the land at home? Zhao raised her broom again and said angrily, you are useless, and you still think about those 2 pieces of broken land. For those 2 pieces of broken land, you work hard every year, and in the end, we can't even eat enough. When you go to the state capital, it's better to do anything than farming. Under the persuasion of the third aunt, the third uncle quickly agreed to move to the city together. Today, we just moved things simply. There are still trivial things like buying furniture next, so we don't have to be so anxious. The courtyard has two entrances. Su Ryu lives in the inner courtyard. The third uncle and the third aunt chose a house in the outer courtyard. The inner and outer courtyards are separated by a partition wall. It was getting dark. Tang Ning walked into the yard and said, "It's getting late. I'll go back first. I'm tired today. You guys should rest early. I'll come back tomorrow." Uncle San didn't care about his two plots of land anymore. He walked into the yard and asked in disbelief, "Are we going to live here in the future?" Tang Ning smiled and waved, "See you tomorrow." Su Ryu sent him outside and said, "It's getting dark. Brother Ning, please walk slowly." Tang Ning turned around and smiled, "It's just a few steps away. It's okay. Go back quickly." When Su Ryu walked back to the yard, Aunt San came over, looked at her, and asked hesitantly, "Xiao Ryu, although you don't have an engagement, everyone has known since you were young that Xiao Ning will marry you in the future. Now?" Su Ryu shook her head and said, "I've already inquired about it. Sister Zhone was forced to marry by that evil governor. If it wasn't for the accident that Xiao Ning fell on her, her life would be ruined. If Xiao Ning left her at this time, wouldn't he be pushing her into the fire pit with his own hands?" Aunt San sighed, "But you?" "I'm fine." Su Ryu took a long breath and said with a smile, "I'm very happy to see Xiao Ning every day and know that he is fine. Fortunate young gentleman." Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 45. After settling Xiao Ryu and the others, it was already very late when Tang Ning returned to Zhone Mansion. He passed by the kitchen and noticed that the light was still on. Zhone Yi slowly cut the vegetables and stared blankly in a certain direction, his eyes dull. Her hand holding the knife moved slowly, the sharp blade getting closer and closer to her fingers. At one point, someone grabbed her wrist. Tang Ning looked at her and said, "If you cut it further, you'll reach your hand." Zhone Yi hurriedly put down the knife, wiped his hands and said, "You're back. Miss, have you prepared the meal? Do you want me to deliver it to my uncle today?" Ching-er walked in from outside and said, "By the way, help me cut this cucumber into slices." Tang Ning looked back at her and asked, "Do you still want to hear the story?" Ching-er looked at him and her expression changed. Starting from last night, in addition to closing the mirror every night, she also secretly swore in her heart that she would never listen to her uncle's stories again. She threw down the cucumber and ran outside. When she crossed the threshold, she accidentally tripped and rolled and disappeared from Tang Ning's eyes. Zhone Yi put the chopped vegetables aside and said, "Ching-er is timid, don't scare her all the time. The one who bullies the little maid is not a real man." But precisely because of Ching-er, he is no longer a real man in the eyes of others. What is a ghost story compared to the greatest insult to one's character? Who hasn't experienced the childhood shadow of one or two movies when they were young? They were so scared that they couldn't sleep at night and didn't dare to go to the toilet alone in the middle of the night. He was just helping the little maid exercise her courage. Tang Ning shook her head and stopped thinking about the matter. She looked at Zhone Yi and asked, "What were you thinking about just now? You almost cut your hand." "I just thought of a poem with two words. I think each has its own merits. I don't know which one is better to use." Zhone Yi shook his head and changed the topic, "Where's Miss Xiaoru? Have you arranged all the things in the house?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "We've almost moved into the new house. There are only some trivial matters left." Zhone Yi thought for a moment, looked at him and asked, "Xiao Ryu said you are his elder brother, but actually, isn't that true?" Tang Ning nodded. "Xiao Ryu is a good girl." Zhone Yi was silent for a while and then said, "I'm sorry for Xiao Ryu. This is just a misunderstanding. Let's make peace. After we make peace, you can marry Xiao Ryu." Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "What about you? What will you do after the divorce?" Zhone Yi lowered his head and said, "I'm fine. Tang Ning couldn't help but smile and said, "It's okay, why are you crying?" Zhou Yi's body trembled and she raised her head to look at him. Her eyes were filled with crystal clear tears and she wiped away her tears, stamped her feet and said angrily, "Why are you so annoying?" She turned around and ran outside. Tang Ning reached out and grabbed her wrist. She was a little panicked and struggled, "You, please let me go." Tang Ning simply picked her up and walked out of the kitchen towards his room. Zhou Yi's voice became even more panicked, and she slapped his back, "What are you doing, you, please let me go." In a small courtyard, Zhou Mingli heard a sound. As soon as he stepped out of the door, he was dragged back by Chen Yuxian. Zhou Mingli turned around and asked in surprise, "Why are you pulling me?" Chen Yuxian closed the door and said, "Read your book and let the children solve their own problems." Zhou Mingli frowned, "But this guy is too courageous." "Come back here." Chen Yuxian dragged him into the room again and closed the door. Tang Ning walked into the room and thought to herself that it was lucky that he was carrying Zhou Yi and not that chubby girl Fang Xinyu, otherwise she would have had to bend her waist. He put Zhou Yi on the bed, walked over and closed the door. Zhou Yi huddled at the foot of the bed, looked at him, and said in panic, "You, what are you going to do?" Tang Ning turned around, walked over, with a smile on her face, and said, "We are going to make peace anyway, so before we make peace, let's take a look." Zhou Yi panicked and said, "Don't come over here. If you come over again, I'll call someone." A smile appeared on Tang Ning's lips. She unbuttoned her coat and said, "You can scream, this is my room. Even if you scream at night, no one will come to save you." If Qing'er sees this scene, the rumors about him will be self-defeating. Zhou Yi saw the smile on the corner of his mouth, as if he had thought of something, and the panic on his face disappeared. He sat on the edge of the bed, closed his eyes, and said, "Come on." The smile on Tang Ning's face froze. A talented woman acting like a hooligan is really hard to resist. He buttoned up his buttons silently, walked to sit next to her, turned his head, looked at Zhou Yi, whose eyes were still closed, looking awe-inspiring and about to sacrifice his life, and said, "Don't be like this, you are still the most talented woman in Lingzhou. Well, how bad it is for people to see it like this." Zhou Yi opened his eyes, looked at him, and said, "I knew you didn't dare." She bent her legs, was silent for a while, and said, "Xiru has been waiting for you for so many years, you can't let her down." "Xiao Ru said that you and I are both talented and beautiful, so I must never let you down." Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Have you two discussed this?" Zhou Yi whispered, "Xiao Ru is a good girl." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "You too." Tang Ning never thought that what Kong Rong let the pair do would happen to him one day. He was the pair. He could see that Xiru was somewhat inferior in front of Zhongai. He thought Zhongai was the perfect match for him, while Zhongai felt guilty towards Xiru. Because of guilt, she could even not care about her situation after the divorce. They were both a little silly and cute. "Xiru has suffered with me for so many years, I won't let her suffer anymore." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "But the Tang Ning that Zhongai knew was the Tang Ning that started 2 months ago." Tang Ning believed that Zhongai could understand what he said. Zhou Yi was silent for a moment, then raised his head and asked, "What did you think when Mom mentioned the wedding ceremony that day?" "What did you think?" Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, "I thought that I couldn't remember the past anyway, and Miss Zhong's looks were so-so, her talent was so-so, and her cooking skills were so-so, 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 so-so. How could I not want to?" Zhou Yi said hurriedly, then realized something, looked at him, wrinkled her nose and asked, "So-so?" Tang Ning counted on her fingers and said, "Look, you don't have long legs like Yao Yao, You're not as good at fighting as she is, you're not as cute as Ching-er, and you're not as adorable as her, and you're also a crybaby. If you cry a lot, your skin will be bad, and you'll age faster than others. I don't want to talk to you anymore. Zhongyi stood up and walked out angrily. Tang Ning sighed and said regretfully, in addition to the cucumber mask, I also want to tell you the secret recipes of several masks. After using them, your skin will become smooth and elastic. Since you don't want to talk anymore, I'll tell Ching-er. Okay, okay, an excited voice came from outside the window. Zhongyi opened the door, and Ching-er, who was accidentally exposed, had already run away. Delicate, smooth, elastic, she ignored Ching-er and muttered, then turned to look at Tang Ning and asked, what is a mask? She was the one who said she didn't want to talk, and now she was the one who took the initiative to talk. If he told her so easily, where would his face be? Tang Ning asked in confusion, did I say anything just now? Zhongyi thought for a moment and said, you did. You said Yao Yao has long legs. I will tell her tomorrow. Nonsense, Tang Ning sat up from the bed and said, I was clearly talking about facial masks just now. Speaking of facial masks, we have to mention human skin. There are actually 5 main types of skin. People with different skin types are suitable for different facial masks. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 46. Tang Ning was a little lucky that when she was working as a salesman in a work-study program, her rhetoric skills were not in vain. Since ancient times, women's desire to become beautiful has no limit. The entire Zhong mansion, from the maids to the mother-in-law, have all learned to use cucumber facial masks. When they had breakfast in the morning, no one saw any cucumbers on the table. Ching-er, your face seems to be paler than yesterday. Really, your face is more tender than a few days ago. When Ching-er and a maid were complimenting each other, the cook came up from behind and asked mysteriously, look, do you think there are fewer wrinkles on my face? Although this has been proven to be effective in later generations, the effect was not so fast. In desperation, Tang Ning had no choice but to popularize it to them. This kind of facial mask should be done once a day at most, and it didn't need to be done every day. It would be useless if it was done more often. Ching-er looked at her, with little stars twinkling in her eyes, and asked, Uncle, how do you know so many things about girls? Several maids beside her also looked at him with admiration. My uncle not only knows how to relieve women's pain when they come, but also knows how to make them whiter and more beautiful, eliminate wrinkles, and make their skin smooth, delicate, and elastic. But even their women don't know these things. My uncle is the one who really understands their women. Uncle, please help me find out what type of skin I have. Uncle, please help me take a look. Uncle, what kind of facial mask is suitable for me? Uncle, don't go. Tang Ning had no choice but to leave. Not only the maids, but also the fat cook from the Zhong family stretched their heads and leaned towards him. If she left too late, he really wouldn't be able to leave. He was going to visit Zairu. When he walked to the door of Zhong mansion, he happened to meet Tang Yao Yao. Tang Yao Yao looked at him and asked, what are you going to do instead of learning martial arts? Tang Ning thought for a while and said, let's start from tomorrow. He looked at Tang Yao Yao and asked, did you apply cucumber on your face? Tang Yao Yao was stunned for a moment. After coming back to his senses, he immediately said, I didn't. Tang Ning said, you have a piece of it stuck in your hair. Tang Yao Yao hurriedly fiddled with her head, and sure enough, there was a thin slice of cucumber. Feeling ashamed and angry, she looked at Tang Ning. Tang Ning thought that she was going to be in trouble. Tang Yajing was exposed to him in person. She became angry and said hurriedly, I almost forgot. I have a few more beauty secrets to tell you. Do you want to listen? I am a naturally beautiful girl. Do you need any secret recipe for beauty? Tang Yao Yao glanced at him, changed her tone, and said, but if you want to say something, I can reluctantly listen. Tang Ning shook her head and said, then you don't have to force it. I have something else to do. See you later. Stop. Tang Yajiao shouted angrily, broke her face, folded her hands around her chest, and said, speak quickly. When other women did this, they would only make a certain part more majestic. When she did this, there was no change. Tang Ning complained in her heart and said, this is a unique secret recipe. It is natural and pollution-free. I am only telling you this, you must not spread the word. Tang Ning has already experienced Tang Yejing's duplicity, but what she said about natural beauty is true. She and Zhongyi are both 16 years old, and their faces are full of collagen, so they don't need any more modifications. Thing. Qing'er is 1 year younger than them. It is natural and pollution-free, so there is no need for it. Su Aryu lived not far from the Zhong mansion, only a few hundred steps away. When Tang Ning walked over, she was the only one in the yard. Seeing him walking in, Su Aryu showed a smile on her face and said, Brother Xiaoning, you are here. Tang Ning looked around and asked, where are the third uncle and third aunt? They went back to the village early in the morning, and there are still some things that have not been moved here. Su Aryu walked into the kitchen, then walked out and said, Brother Xiaoning, I cooked porridge this morning, do you want some? Tang Ning looked at the expectant expression on her face, but she couldn't bear to say no. Although he had already had breakfast this morning, he still took the bowl from her hand and said with a smile, I happen to be a little hungry. The original owner of the house that Peng Chen was looking for moved his family and was eager to sell it. There were large furniture in the house, all of which were 80% new, and they were all sold at a low price. They only needed to add some small items. Tang Ning was drinking porridge in the yard, while Su Aryu walked briskly and gathered around him to mutter. The weather is very good today. I took out Brother Xiaoning's old books and dried them. Brother Xiaoning, when he comes tomorrow, take them all with him. I thought about it last night. If we just rely on weaving, it will take many, many years to repay Miss Tang's money. We still have some money left, and the third aunt said we can do some small business in the city. I will find a way to deal with the money. Brother Xiaoning, you don't have to worry about it. You just need to study hard and prepare for the state examination in 3 years' time. Tang Ning did not tell her that the time limit agreed between him and Tang Yao Yao was 1 year. In 1 year, no matter what business they did, it would be difficult to earn 1,000 taels of silver. After finishing the porridge, he put down the bowl, looked at her, shook his head and said, you only need to do one thing now, which is to take good care of yourself here. I have my own way to deal with the money. My body is fine. Su Aryu shook her head and said, Brother Xiaoning doesn't understand business matters. You just have to study with peace of mind. I'll take care of other things. Tang Ning thought for a moment, looked at her, and asked tentatively, Xiao Aryu, can I not take the imperial examination? Perhaps it was because she read too many books in her previous life, but in this life, Tang Ning really had no interest in becoming an official through the imperial examination. He was confident that even if he didn't become an official, he could make Xiru live a good life. But once he entered the officialdom, his fate and even his life were not under his control. Tang Ning didn't like that kind of atmosphere. Abandon the imperial examination. Su Aryu looked at him, her body trembling slightly and her face gradually turning pale. By the time Tang Ning realized something was wrong, she was already squatting on the ground and crying. Tang Ning hurriedly knelt down, patted her shoulder gently, and said anxiously, What's wrong, what's wrong? Su Aryu raised her head, pear blossoms that had been crying for a long time, looked at him with tearful eyes, choked up and said, "Brother Xiaoning, have you forgotten how much suffering you have endured over the years in order to study and to be named on the gold medal list one day? No matter how many crimes I committed and how many people I begged, I finally got the opportunity to take the state examination." Su'eryu cried so sadly. Even after knowing that he had lost his memory and was married to Zhongyi, she had never cried so sadly. Test, Tang Ning looked at her and said helplessly, "Isn't it good for me to take the exam?" He didn't know how much hard work Tang Ning had put in and how much hardship she had endured in order to be able to take part in the state examination, but Xiao Ryu and the others must have suffered no less. The fact that she cried so sadly showed that this matter was extremely important in her heart. In this world, the only person he couldn't make her sad was Xiao Ryu. Su'eryu raised her head, wiped her tears, looked at him, and asked, "Really?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "Really?" Tang Ning hates seeing women cry the most, but in the past 2 days, Tang Yaoyao cried, Zhongyi cried, and now even Zyra cried whenever she asked. Their women were indeed made of water. Su'eryu held his hand and said comfortingly, "Brother Xiaoning has been gifted and smart since he was a child. Even if he forgets what he has learned before and misses the state exam, it doesn't matter. We will have another one. In this era where everything is inferior and the only way to get high is through education, the only and most recognized path for scholars is the imperial examination. After 10 years of hard work, even if you achieve nothing, you can't do anything else. At most, I should be a master, teach students, and sell calligraphy and painting. Otherwise it is depravity." Obviously, in Su'eryu's eyes, Tang Ning was on the verge of depravity. There are many things that can be done in life. Although he is still unwilling to take the road of imperial examination, he still wants to pass Zyra first. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 47. Remember 3Q Chinese website in 1 second, read wonderful novels for free without pop-ups. After finally coaxing Zyra to be happy, Tang Ning helped Zyra up, and Zhonggai, Qing'er and Tang Yaoyao walked in from outside. Zhongyi looked at Xiao Ryu, whose face was full of tears, and hurriedly came over and asked, "What's wrong? He bullied you?" Su'eryu shook her head hastily, "No, no. At this time, you are still protecting him." Zhongyi frowned and glanced at Tang Ning, and said with some sadness, "Zyra is so good to you, you." Tang Yaoyao looked at him with contempt. Even Qing'er stuck out her tongue at him to show her contempt. "Sister Zhong, it's not like that." Su'eryu showed a trace of panic on her face and hurriedly explained, "Just now, I just remembered something." Tang Yaoyao said, "Miss Zyra, don't always protect her, or I'll beat him to vent your anger." It was hard for them to believe that they had not bullied Zyra. The servants of the Zhong family came in carrying several large boxes. Tang Ning asked in surprise, "What is this?" Zhongyi pointed to one of the boxes and said, "This is the gift my mother and I picked for Xiao Ryu." Tang Ning pointed to a few others. "What about these?" Zhongyi said, "These are gifts from Yao Yao." Tang Ning opened it and took a look. One box contained various precious tonics, one box contained precious silk, and another box contained dazzling jewelry. This gift from Fairy Tang is really big enough. Su'eryu waved her hands repeatedly, "No, I can't have these." Tang Ning looked at Tang Yaoyao and said, "Keep these medicinal materials and take the rest back." The value of her box can already buy several such houses. Tang Yaoyao pouted and said, "I gave these to Zyra, not to you." Having said this, she still took the other boxes away obediently. The box Zhongyi brought was not that expensive. It contained some cloth, rouge, gouache, and other things that girls could use. Su'eryu refused at first, but then she had no choice but to accept it after Tang Ning's suggestion. After accepting the gift, Zhongyi and Tang Yaoyao took her to the cloth store to measure the clothes, leaving him alone here. The friendship that Su Ryu and Zhongyi could establish was something that even Tang Ning didn't expect. According to the normal routine, they should fight. He quickly figured out that it was because both of them were cute. The word K means worthy in ancient proverbs. Tang Yejing is also very cute, with a true nature and no pretense. It would be even more cute if she didn't have to pay back the 1,000 taels of silver she owed him. If she had persisted, he wouldn't have had to write that IOU. We had dinner together at Zhone Mansion. The two women who were supposed to be enemies talked and laughed all day long. Zhongyi said that he would teach Su Ryu to read, and Su Ryu said that she would teach Zhongyi to embroider. For some reason, Tang Ning always felt a chill on her back. Zhone Mingli seemed to have something on his mind. Halfway through the meal, he suddenly put down his bowl and chopsticks, looked at Tang Ning, and said, "There is something about this state examination that I just learned today." Everyone around the table looked at Zhone Mingli. The news coming from Kyoto is that the imperial court seems to have made some changes to the scientific examination system. There are rumors that starting from this year, those who are absent from the Fanzhou examination and above without any reason will be regarded as contempt for the imperial examination and will not be allowed to take the examination for 3 consecutive years. Reference again. The reasons for being allowed to miss the exam definitely do not include amnesia. 3 consecutive terms, that is 3 years and 3 years and 3 years. After not being able to take the state examination for almost 10 years, both Su Ryu and Zhongyi looked a little pale. Although it's just a rumor, I'm not afraid of 10,000, just in case. Zhone Mingli looked at him and said, "So, you still have to take part in the state exam this time. Even if you fail, it is better than not being able to take the exam for 10 years. He looked at Tang Ning seriously and said, "Just give it a try." The state examination is the first step in the formal imperial examination. Those who fail will need to pass several examinations in the next 2 years before they can regain the qualifications for the state examination. It's okay not to take the state exam once, but if you don't take it 4 times in a row, Xiru will be very sad, Zhongai will be disappointed, Tang Yaoyao will blame herself, her father-in-law, mother-in-law, everyone will be disappointed. Moreover, it will also reveal that he does not want to participate in the imperial examination, is self-destructive, self-degenerate, ashamed of himself, and cannot extricate himself, and exposes the fact that he is a salty fish. There was no way to avoid it. Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, "Then let's try. It's just an exam, Ning-er, don't worry too much." Chen Yuxian looked at him and comforted, "Your father-in-law took the state exam 3 times in a row before entering the provincial exam." Zhone Mingli put down his chopsticks, his face looked a little unnatural, and said, "Why are you talking about this?" Chen Yuxian ignored him, looked at Tang Ning, and said with a smile, "It doesn't matter. Even if we fail, we will prepare well so that we can start all over again in 3 years." Tang Ning smiled and nodded. He had some understanding of the imperial examinations of this dynasty. On a large scale, the rules of the Tang and Song dynasties were still followed, but there were too many changes in the details, including examination time, content, focus. There were too many changes. The state examination is roughly equivalent to the interpretation examination in the Tang dynasty, and the time is pushed back 1 month, probably from early September to mid-September. Only those who pass the state examination are eligible to participate in the provincial examination to be held in the capital next spring. If they can pass the provincial examination, they will definitely win the title of Jinshi. The final palace examination was just to rank the Jinshi who passed the provincial examination, and divide them into the top 3. This is similar to the rules of the Song dynasty. Although the 3 Jinshi were all Jinshi, their treatment was very different. The first and third Jinshi had unlimited prospects. The second Jinshi was like his father-in-law, who was a county magistrate sent out to work. His future career path depended entirely on luck. As for the third Jinshi, he was not even qualified to be a county magistrate sent out to work. But even this Thirchinchi was selected from the best students in the world. 99% of them failed in the previous exams. The exam that Tang Ning was about to face was the first step to officially embark on the road of the imperial examination. Every step forward was extremely difficult. He was like a salted fish that was unwilling to turn over. Under the expectant gaze of everyone, he jumped onto the chopping block. Zhou Mingli looked at him and said, "From now on, you can come and go in my study at will. If you see anything you don't understand, feel free to ask me." Tang Ning nodded and said, "Thank you, father-in-law. We are a family, you are welcome," Zhou Mingli said, and then stood up and left. "Hey, you haven't even finished your meal, and you are going out again." Chen Yuxian looked at his back as he walked out, sighed, and looked at Tang Ning and said, "Ning, if you pass the exam and become an official in the future, don't learn from him. Taking the exam is a helpless move, but if you want to pass, the probability is smaller than the probability of being admitted to Harvard or Oxford in the future. This is a question of whether you can, not whether Tang Ning wants to. Dad must have something important again." Zhou Yi spoke up, easing some of Tang Ning's embarrassment. Chen Yuxian shook his head and said with some concern, "The villagers of 2 villages in the county make a living by growing vegetables. If the vegetables and fruits produced by the vegetable farmers cannot be sold, their work this year will be in vain, and their families will lose their livelihoods." This morning, 2 vegetable farmers were overwhelmed and jumped into the river. The people were rescued, but if the vegetables and fruits cannot be sold again, I am afraid they will. Tang Ning knew that there was a very important reason for the unsaleable fruits and vegetables, following the trend. If everyone knew that cucumbers can whiten and nourish the skin, replenish water, and prevent wrinkles this year, they would rush to buy them, causing the price of cucumbers to rise. Driven by profit, more people will grow cucumbers next year. In the second year, there will be too many cucumbers planted, the market will be saturated, and the goods will not be sold, resulting in unsaleable goods. Or maybe the women in Lingzhou City have abandoned cucumbers in the second year and used la mer and clé de pot butte, and the large group of vegetable farmers who grow cucumbers will have to starve. Tang Ning shook his head and asked casually, "What fruits and vegetables are unsaleable?" Chen Yuxian thought for a while and said, "It seems to be cucumbers." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 48. After dinner, Zhou Yi took Su Ryu to her room. Su Ryu was very interested in the cucumber mask that she said could whiten and fight wrinkles. The main thing is whitening. Although Su Ryu's skin is fair, it can't be compared with the pampered eldest daughter of a wealthy family. In fact, the darkest one is Tang Yao Yao, but it is limited to the 3 of them. Perhaps because of martial arts training, her skin has a slightly healthy color. Even so, she can barely be called fair and beautiful. Well. A sighing voice sounded from behind Tang Ning. Tang Ning turned around and saw Tang Yao Yao standing behind him. She was startled and asked, "What are you doing standing here?" "I've been standing here for a long time." Tang Yao Yao looked at him and asked, "What are you thinking about, so entranced?" Tang Ning quickly shook her head, No, it's nothing." Tang Yao Yao looked at him and said suspiciously, "You were so panicked. You said 3 things in a row. Did you say bad things about me in your heart?" If Fairy Tang was to be a police officer, he would definitely be the top one. How is that possible? Since she couldn't read minds anyway, Tang Ning changed the subject and said, "Why are you sighing?" "Let's not talk about it for now." Tang Yao Yao narrowed her eyes and looked at him. "You said the facial mask you told me is a unique secret recipe." Tang Ning nodded. Tang Yao Yao asked again, "You still said you won't tell anyone else?" Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "You and Xiao Yuking are sisters. What difference do you and her have? What's hers is yours, and what's yours is hers. What's the difference between telling you and telling her?" Tang Ning's cleverness allowed the matter to pass. Tang Yao stopped asking questions and said somewhat depressedly, "My father stopped giving me pocket money. Now I don't have any money." Tang Ning said in surprise, "Didn't there still be 800 taels that day? I bought a gift for Xiaoru." Although she didn't ask for it, the money is gone, Tang Yao replied. Tang Ning thought for a while, looked at her and asked, "You are here to ask me to pay back the money, right?" She only lent her 1,000 taels to herself for 2 days. She agreed that it would be 1 year, and you have to keep your word. Tang Yao looked at him and asked, "Do you have the money to pay it back?" "No," Tang Ning replied honestly. Who would have thought that, overnight, Tang Yajing would go from being the richest woman in Lingzhou city to being bankrupt and penniless. He looked at Tang Yao and asked, "Why did your father stop your pocket money?" "He asked me to recite poems. If I didn't recite them, he wouldn't give me pocket money," Tang Yao said dejectedly. "I'm only given 100 taels to recite one poem. I'll starve to death without reciting poems. Memorize one song, I only get 100 taels." Tang Ning was willing to bet that if he recited a poem, Tang Yao's father, the god of wealth, would give him 100 taels, and he could recite it until the Tang family went bankrupt several times. Unfortunately, although they both have the surname Tang, they do not have the same father. After he finished speaking, he asked doubtfully, "Why did he ask you to recite the poem?" "It's not Xiaoi's fault," Tang Yao said with gritted teeth. "He has asked me to learn from Xiaoi since we were young. When Xiaoi wrote a poem, he asked me to memorize one. You count, she has been there some time ago. How many poems have you written?" Under his inspiration and guidance, Zhongyi wrote a lot of poems in the past few days, and they were widely circulated. In total, there must be more than a dozen poems. It was those dozen or so poems that solidified her title as the most talented woman in Lingzhou. Zhongyi is a famous talented woman in Lingzhou and a representative of outstanding women in Lingzhou. Tang Yao has such a best friend who lives next door and is compared with her every day. It can be imagined that her childhood until now, to be able to maintain such a close relationship with Zhongyi must be true love. However, they are two people with different personalities. Tang Yao's father wants her to become a lady like Zhongyi. Maybe it will be possible in the next life. Tang Yao had a look of dissatisfaction on her face and said, "Where is Xiaoi? I want to settle the score with her." Tang Ning pointed in a certain direction and said, "In the room with Xiaoru." Tang Yao had already stepped out with one foot, then stepped back again, sighing for a long time. He still feels guilty about Xiaoru and doesn't dare to see her. Alas! Tang Ning also sighed. Tang Yao looked back at him and asked, "Why are you sighing?" Tang Ning said dejectedly, "Those who miss the state exam will not be able to take it within 10 years. I have to take the state exam this time." Not only does he have to take the state exam, but he also wants to get the goblin's money as soon as possible. The creditor is already in such trouble. As a borrower, you should have the conscience to pay back the money early. He didn't want to use Zhongyi's money, and he didn't want to talk to his father-in-law. If he hadn't put all the precious medicinal materials that Mr. Sun gave him last time in the Zhong family's warehouse, leaving only one or two, maybe he wouldn't be so trapped. As for the great return pill, of course it cannot be sold. Naturally, the tonic that Tang Yao gave to Xiaoru cannot be touched, and Tang Yao will not let him touch it. So there is nothing we can do for now. Why? Why? They were both forced to do things they didn't like. The two sighed at the same time and looked at each other, feeling like they were in the same boat. By the way, when I look at the other person, I find it much more pleasing to the eye. The state exam is inevitable, but the money problem can still be solved if we think of a way. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Did you apply cucumber mask again just now?" Fairy Tang subconsciously touched her face and hair. After finding nothing, she looked at him and said, "No. You still say no, but you smell like cucumber. Tang Ning looked at her and shook his head, saying, you can just apply that thing once before going to bed at night. It's useless to use it more often. He didn't finish his words, but suddenly he seemed to think of something, and his eyes lit up. Tang Yao Yao glared at him, you said I smelled. You don't have any pocket money, and I just happen to be short of money. Tang Ning looked at her and said, how about we do something? Tang Yao Yao was surprised, what? Tang Ning thought for a moment and felt that this method was feasible, so he nodded and said, I have a good idea to make money. Tang Yao Yao looked curious and asked, what idea? Today. Tang Ning said 2 words and suddenly realized a problem. He borrowed 1,000 taels of silver from Tang Yao Yao. In addition to buying a house and furniture for Xiaoru, he still had about 300 taels left. 300 taels is actually not a small amount. According to the current purchasing power, it is equivalent to more than 100,000 or 200,000 in the future. In other words, he already had the original capital needed for this matter. Then why does he need Tang Yao Yao? Why did he tell her about this? It's totally unnecessary. Come on, what's your idea? Tang Yao Yao looked at him excitedly, eager to try. Tang Ning was stunned, sighed, and said, I just thought about it carefully, and I think this method doesn't work. Really? Tang Yao Yao looked at him and said, I plan to teach you martial arts from tomorrow. Okay, Tang Ning nodded. If I knew you had something fun to do without me. Tang Yao Yao lowered her head and looked at her fist. Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, I suddenly feel that this method is still feasible. Tang Ning looked at her and said, this is what happened. After listening to her, Tang Yao Yao nodded excitedly and said, I need Xiaoai's help in this matter. He looked at Tang Ning and asked, how do we split the bill afterwards? Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, 50-50. He was not a stingy person. Tang Yajing had been generous to him, so he couldn't treat her unfairly. No, Tang Yao Yao thought for a moment and said, you are just giving advice. Xiaoai and I are the ones who really do the work. We should get a bigger share. Then I'll take 60% and you take 40%. Deal. Tang Yao Yao nodded in agreement, stood up and said, I'll go and discuss it with Xiaoai. Tang Ning shook her head. He was so uneducated. He was terrible. He really couldn't be blamed this time. Tang Yao Yao was right. In this matter, he was just giving advice. It was she and Zhong Gai who really played a big role. In today's world where the concept of beauty and skincare is not very mature, it is ridiculous that cucumbers, a magical tool that can be eaten and used, can still be unsaleable. Some time ago, he used a poem about the Kixi festival to liberate the hearts of the women in Lingzhou. This time, it's their turn to liberate their hearts. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 49. You lied to me again. When Tang Yao Yao came out of Zhong Yi's room, she looked at Tang Ning with a look of embarrassment on her face. Tang Ning looked at her and asked in surprise, what did I lie to you about? She said angrily, 46 points, you got more. Aren't I thinking about you too? Tang Ning looked at her and said helplessly, if it's 4 or 6 points, you and Xiaoai can each get 2 shares. If it's 5 or 5 points, how will you two divide it? Tang Yao Yao frowned and thought for a while, 50-50, it seemed that the two of them really couldn't tell each other apart. Seeing that she seemed to be convinced by him, Tang Ning sighed inwardly, this girl is so easy to deceive. She is the only daughter of rich man Tang, so he must be careful not to be deceived of his huge wealth in the future. At the same time, he also roughly understood why Mr. Tang kept asking her to study with Xiao Yi. A good daughter is better than her father. There is no harm in a girl reading more books. Tang Yao Yao thought for a while and said, I'll go ask Xiaoi. Wait a minute, Tang Ning stopped her in time and said, 50 minus 50 is 50 minus 50. This is fair. I don't want to take advantage of you. The bestie combination of Tang Yao Yao and Zhong Yi is an unsolvable combination. One can't be deceived, the other can't be defeated, and the one's Hong Gai I can make up for is Tang Yajing's brain. The method of dividing the spoils has been decided, and now it's time to take action. Peng Chen is not here today, he should have gone out with his father-in-law. He was not Tang Ning's personal bodyguard. Otherwise, his father-in-law would be accused of using public equipment for personal use at some point. With Tang Yao Yao here, he didn't need bodyguards at all. After going to the county government office, he confirmed from a clerk that his father-in-law had indeed gone to the two villages where cucumbers were unsaleable. After inquiring about the places, he told Zhong Yiziru that he and Tang Yao Yao were ready to conduct an on-site inspection. What Tang Yaji likes to do most is not to do serious things. She has great enthusiasm for things other than reciting poems and lyrics, embroidering and playing the piano. She is the most distinctive mudslide among the clear streams of women in Lingzhou. The places they were going to were two neighboring villages. These two villages, named Xiaoku Village and Shanku Village respectively, are close to water sources and have fertile soil. The villagers do not make a living from farming like the people in other villages. They have been growing vegetables as a business since decades ago. They provide most of the fruits and vegetables needed by restaurants and wealthy families in Lingzhou City. When Tang Ning and Tang Yao Yao walked to the entrance of the village, they saw a large green vegetable field. Although at this time last year, late cucumbers were selling well and prices soared, but this year, so many were planted all at once, and the market couldn't digest them. It would be a huge loss. The two walked to the entrance of the village and saw Zhong Mingli from a distance. A group of people surrounded Zhong Mingli and begged, Master Zhong, you are our parent officer, please save us. Yes, Mr. Zhong, if we can't sell so many vegetables, we will have no choice but to die. Sir, save us. Huh. They deserve it. Tang Yao Yao glanced at the crowd and said, last year at this time, cucumbers were scarce, so they kept raising the price, hoping to sell cucumbers at gold prices, and this year they kept going again. It's their turn to complain now, right? She glanced at those people and said, I don't even want to help them. Tang Ning shook her head and said, whoever you have trouble with, don't make trouble with Yinzi. Why are you talking like my father? Tang Yao Yao glanced at him and walked toward the crowd. Why are you here? Zhong Mingli was surrounded by these people and was irritated. When he saw the two people walking over, he frowned at first and then relaxed quickly. He still clearly remembered the fake gods in Kuajia village last time. Tang Yao Yao smiled and said, Uncle Zhong, we are here to buy cucumbers. A short-bearded man stood next to Zhong Mingli, waved his hand impatiently, and said, little girl, you can pick as many cucumbers as you want from the field, for free. Tang Yao Yao's eyes lit up and she asked, is it true? Really, the man said impatiently again, and immediately looked at Zhong Mingli and said, Master Zhong, you can't just watch us die. On the other side, Tang Yao Yao looked at Tang Ning happily and said, go back and call someone to pick 10,000 caddies today. Zhong. The man just said something, but his voice suddenly stopped. He looked at Tang Yao Yao, pursed his lips, and said, girl, this. Tang Yao Yao blinked, looked at him, and asked, didn't you say you can pick it at will? I mean. The short-bearded man looked at her and said, you too can pick as many as you want. Tang Yao Yao thought for a while and said, then let's pick slowly, don't be in a hurry, since we have plenty of time anyway, we can always pick 10,000 kilograms. The short-bearded man thought for a while and hurriedly added, you two can only pick it once. Tang Yao Yao shook her head and curled her lips and said, you are such a boring person who goes back on your word. Zhong Mingli coughed lightly and said, Yao Yao, Don't mess around. Uncle Zhong, we are not messing around. Tang Yao Yao looked at him and said, we are really here to buy cucumbers. The short-bearded man just wanted to get rid of this annoying goblin and asked hurriedly, how much do you want to buy? Tang Yao Yao turned around, pointed to the green vegetable garden, and said, I want everything here. The short-bearded man was stunned, and asked uncertainly, how much? Tang Yao Yao said again, I want all the cucumbers here. The short-bearded man looked at her and said again, girl, are you kidding? Tang Yao Yao threw out a few banknotes and said dissatisfiedly, why are you so long-winded? Tang Ning always thought that Tang Yao Yao's action of slapping banknotes was very handsome, but it was a pity that there was no table here, so she couldn't show her most domineering side. The short-bearded man took a glance and knew that these banknotes were at least 300 taels, which was definitely enough to buy these cucumbers. As if afraid that Tang Yao Yao would go back on her word, he reached out to take the banknote and said, girl, I'll ask someone to pick them for you. Wait. Tang Yao Yao took the banknote away and said, don't rush to pick them yet. How much do you sell these cucumbers for? The short-bearded man hurriedly said, the market price is 20 wen per catty. Tang Yao Yao said without hesitation, 5 wen. The short-bearded man's face changed, girl, this won't do. Tang Ning found that Tang Yao Yao was a very contradictory person. On the one hand, she spent money like water, throwing away tens of thousands of taels of silver without blinking an eye, and was an out-and-out spendthrift woman. On the other hand, she was very calculative and argued with the man for half a penny. She would definitely be able to be frugal in the future. The final price was 10 wen per catty. The short-bearded man looked pale, and could only nod his head and said, 10 cents is 10 cents. He knew in his heart that a few hundred taels of silver was not much for the big families in the state capital, but no one would be stupid enough to spend so much silver to buy a bunch of cucumbers that could not be eaten and could only rot. Rich people are common, but stupid rich people are rare. Now it is not easy to meet a stupid one. Although the price is a bit low, if they miss it, their whole village will have to starve this winter. Tang Yao Yao only used half of the price to get the right to use this vegetable garden. She asked Tang Ning to draft a contract on the spot, and the leaders of the two villages signed it readily. From then on, she, Tang Yao Yao, completely contracted this cucumber field, strangling the lifeline of all the beauty-loving women in Lingzhou. The villagers of the two villages took the banknotes and left happily. Zhong Mingli looked at them and frowned, saying, what are you two doing? Tang Yao Yao defended, we are not doing anything. Zhong Mingli shook his head helplessly, looked at her, and said, if your father finds out that you are wasting money again, be careful about your pocket money next month. I didn't waste money. Tang Yao Yao shook her head innocently, pointed at Tang Ning, and said, he paid for all the money. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 50. It is difficult to draw the bones of a dragon or a tiger, and you can know a person's face but not his heart. Tang Ning and Tang Yao Yao have known each other for such a long time, and he only knows that she is good at martial arts and spends money lavishly, but he does not know that she is also a traitor who betrays her teammates at a critical moment. Although Zhong Mingli knows that Tang Ning is not as willful and reckless as Tang Yao Yao, he still looks at him and reminds him, the state exam is coming soon. Even if it is just a test, you should review seriously and not slack off. Tang Ning glanced at Tang Yao Yao and could only nod in agreement. The cucumber fields of Shank village and Xiaoku village were thus contracted by Tang Yao Yao. After much bargaining, Tang Ning's current net worth is still about 100 taels. If he does not buy anything big, he can be considered wealthy. Of course, the premise is that he does not count the 1,000 taels of silver he owes Tang Yao Yao. When the two of them went back together, he looked at Tang Yao Yao and said calmly, you traitor, I am so disappointed. Oh, don't be so stingy. Tang Yaojing said with a nonchalant look, we are good sisters. Tang Ning stopped and looked at her. I mean. Tang Yao Yao looked at him and said seriously, Xiao I and I are good sisters, you are Xiao I's husband, we are good friends, between good friends, shouldn't I share the happiness and you share the difficulties? Although Tang Yajing is not educated, she can make a lot of sense. Tang Ning doesn't reason with her, because when she can't win, she will choose another method. He continued to walk forward and said, I don't have a friend who betrays his friends like you. If we are not friends, then you admit that we are sisters. Tang Yao Yao looked at him, thought for a moment, and said, by the way, you are a grown man, why do you know so much about women? I read it in a book. Don't use this excuse every time. Tang Yao Yao shook her head and said, I heard that there is such a kind of people. Although they are born with a male body, they have a female heart and are very eager to become women. They will secretly wear women's clothes and use women's rouge. They know how to dress themselves up better than women. As she spoke, the look she gave Tang Ning began to become strange. Tang Ning thought about it, his eyes intentionally or unintentionally swept across Tang Yao Yao's chest, and said, I also heard that there is such a kind of people. Although they are women, God has not given them a complete female body. It's really sad and lamentable. Tang Yao Yao's face showed a trace of doubt, instinctively felt that this was not a good thing, looked at him, and asked, Mr. Tang, what do you mean? Tang Ning sighed and said, looking from the side, there are no mountains and no peaks. The distance and height are the same. I don't know the true face of typing. There is a girl in the Tang family named Ye Jing. Tang Yao Yao began to pinch her fingers and creaked, I heard it, you called me a fairy. Tang Ning sighed again and said, fairy, generally referred to as a woman with charming appearance, this is to praise your beauty, read more books when you have time, and ask Xiao I if you don't understand. There are also advantages to not having read books. At least at this time, she would not associate these two lines of poetry with her complimenting her flat chest. Mid-Autumn Festival is approaching, and there are endless banquets of various names in Lingzhou City. This year's Mid-Autumn Festival is particularly lively. It is the year of the state examination. Mid-Autumn Festival is approaching. In less than a month, it will be the day of the state examination. Although Lingzhou Gongyuan is not as good as the Gongyuan in the capital, it is also the largest place for imperial examinations in nearby states. Not every state has a Gongyuan. There are also students from neighboring states who come to Lingzhou to participate in the state examination. In the next month, thousands of students will gather in Lingzhou. Although there is still more than half a month to September, there are already many students gathered in Lingzhou City. Most of the restaurants and inns in the city are occupied by these people. A few days before Mid-Autumn Festival, it seems that the atmosphere of the festival has been infected, and the atmosphere of preparing for the exam in the city has been reduced. Every night, whether in restaurants or boats, there is a lively scene. Among the women, some talented ladies have also organized many activities for women. During the day, there are mostly cudgel games. At night, there are various literary gatherings, most of which invite some famous talents. The customs of the Chen state are obviously much more open than those of the Song dynasty. Although the barriers between men and women still exist, they are not extreme. Zhongyi is already a married woman. Generally speaking, after marriage, women naturally cannot show up as much as before marriage, but as the first talented woman in Lingzhou and the spiritual leader of many women, she still has to attend more social events in the past 2 days. Tang Yao Yao has no social events. There are not many games suitable for women. Cudgel is one of them, and it is also a more popular activity in Lingzhou. Cudgel is the prototype of football, but women's cudgel is not women's football in later generations. They play football in a fancy way, which is similar to kicking shuttlecock. It is not about who can kick farther, but who can kick higher, longer, and more in a fancy way. Zhongyi is often invited to participate in such activities, but no one has ever invited Tang Yao Yao. A sepak takraw ball, the rule is that the sepak takraw ball must not fall to the ground. She can play all day without interruption. Even the maids in the Zhong mansion are unwilling to play with her. In the evening, the activities of the women are mostly poetry and literature gatherings, which are not related to her major, and she will not participate. But today is different. Today's gathering is at the Zhong family, which is organized by Zhong Yi, and Tang Yao Yao is also half the host. Although Zhong Yi is known as the most talented woman in Lingzhou, the theme of this time is not a poetry gathering. If we have to call it a meeting, we can name it the first beauty seminar for women in Lingzhou. It's okay to replace women with women. In Zhong's house, several women surrounded Chen Yuxian and spoke in surprise. This little cucumber can remove wrinkles on the face. I heard that it can not only remove wrinkles, but also whiten the skin. Do you think Yuxian looks younger than before? Now that you say that, I really think so. A woman took Chen Yuxian's hand and said, "Oh, don't keep us in suspense. Is what they said really?" Chen Yuxian smiled and said, "Whether it works or not, you will know after you use it." In another small courtyard, there were also shadows. Hu Jin mysteriously pulled Zhong Yi aside and whispered, "Xiaoi, are you telling the truth? Can it really make my skin whiter?" Hu Jin's skin color was slightly darker, and the difference was more obvious when she stood with Zhong Yi. This has always been her concern. Zhong Yi chuckled and said, "It's not that fast to get white, but as long as you persist, there will be obvious results in about a month." The girl next to her looked at Tang Yao Yao and said in surprise, "Sister Yao Yao seems to be whiter than before." Tang Yao Yao just showed a satisfied smile on her face, and the girl circled around her a few times and said, "Sister Yao Yao used to be dark, much darker than Sister Xiaoi." When the angry Tang Yajing chased the girl named Zyro all over the yard, Tang Ning was flipping through a book. There is one very good thing about the ancient imperial examinations. Although they would not mark the key points before the test, they would set the test outline. There are only a few books to go back and forth, and they will never go beyond the outline. However, after several reforms, the imperial examinations of the Chen kingdom tended to develop more comprehensively, involving not only classics, history, poetry, but also law, mathematics, and policy questions. Although Tang Ning's human camera is not in vain, it is still a bit difficult to remember so many books in a short period of time. More importantly, he will be hungry. Zhong Yi is very busy today, but fortunately there is Xiru. When Tang Ning was hungry while reading, she had already prepared the food and brought it over. At the Zhong family, the girl rubbing her butt took a bite of the cucumber and said proudly, "Let's see what Shui Yun can do to compare with us this time." There have been many gatherings in the past few days, and many of their schedules have overlapped. The leaders of each group naturally used various methods to invite more influential people to participate in order to show their connections and form a comparison invisibly. Almost everyone knew that Shui Yun chose to hold the so-called literary gathering on the same day and at the same time, and invited many talented people from Lingzhou to help out, just for Zhong Yi. Zhong Yi did not invite many guests, but today, there was a constant stream of uninvited guests, but I don't know what the situation is with Shui Yun.